Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And my name is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work in the area of talent management, and I've been doing this podcast with the idea of bringing to you what's really happening in technology and talent. Every single day, you will find that there's something or the other which has changed, but one thing which has not changed a lot is education. If you see, higher education was designed for the industrial age, and one size fits all. It's the same content which is given to all the students in the classroom. That happens in grade one, it happens in higher education. It's not very different. Now, as we have Gen AI, things are changing. One of the biggest things that we need to do is to actually also say, how does education change as we are getting into this world of Gen AI? And to answer this question, I'm so delighted to have with me Srikanth Iyengar. He is the CEO of UpGrad Enterprises. And Srikanth is going to be the right person to talk to us about each one of this. So, with no further ado, thank you so much for joining us today, Srikanth.
Abhijit, thank you so much for the warm and strong introduction. I now have to live up to it in the podcast, but such a delight speaking to you today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to first start by, asking a little about, UpGrad for the benefit of those who are not familiar with UpGrad. Just tell me at a high level, what really does UpGrad do and its relevance today to what we are talking about.
Sure. So we're very proud of what we're building at UpGrad. So UpGrad is a 10-year-old company. We were founded in 2015, headquartered in Mumbai. We work globally across 100 countries with learners from all these countries. But I think what's important is across our 10 years, we've skilled more than 10 to 11 million people across the world, something that we are really proud of. On an average, in a year, we now skill 2 million plus. So the impact that we are able to help create in people's professional lives is something we're very proud of. We work on long format courses in partnership with universities across the globe. We work on short format skill-based courses, specifically in the tech data area. We also work on soft skills and leadership, which are extremely critical to progress in today's environment. We work with some of the world's largest corporates to help them with their workforces. So, across the board, we are a skilling company who straddles the entire ecosystem.
So, from the point of view of just knowing which aspect we are talking about, how do you differentiate between people use terms like skilling, learning, education, training as interchangeable? Just to get all of us on the same page, how do you differentiate?
Sure. I think education across the globe is often associated with a formal milestone. It could be a degree, it could be a high school diploma, it could be a postgraduate education, and that's linked with a university or a body that can provide you with a professional qualification. It could even be a CFA or a CA, and that's what most people think education is all about. But if you take learning, if you went back 30 years, learning was synonymous with education. The belief was you learned and then you worked. But today, learning is a lifelong journey. That's because the world is changing so fast that you need to keep upskilling yourself literally on every month, every year to stay up to speed with the economy, because the world has become global. Access and location are not an issue, and you're also trying to be the best you can for the role you're looking at across a very, very diverse workforce in terms of age as well. So that's how learning differentiates from education. And when we say skills, what we've also found is, by definition, education tends to connote theory. You've learned something from a book or from an instructor, but skilling tends to be a lot more practical because a lot of people learn hands-on, especially if you take technology as an example. You've got to work on a technical lab to know exactly how the skill is done. You might have watched someone else do it. So that's what I'd say, that yes, people use these terms synonymously, but education is probably a little more milestone-based formal, whereas learning is lifelong. And I'd say skilling encompasses this, but it also includes making it more live, realistic, small group based, and that's what we focus very much on.
So, in some sense, the way I would think about it is that there is content and there is context. As you are learning stuff, you are really trying to figure out what does it really mean to the work that I do. And then, when people talk about learning on the job, they're really talking about contextualizing it to not just my job, specifically the organizational work style, and also specific to my targets, my performance measures. How do I use this to get better? So that's really how one could also add another dimension to it. A lot of times when we think about formal education, I think we get caught in this whole challenge that content is, it used to be that higher education was the place where you went for content. Today, content is available for free everywhere. I mean, so in that kind of a scenario, what really is changing? How do you move from doing better content to actually building capability better? What
Yeah,
is that
yeah,
path?
yeah. Absolutely. Very, very, it's a great question, very valid in today's environment. So if you go back again, if you look at how, and I'll talk from an enterprise perspective because we work closely with many enterprises. So typically, when you look at early stage or fresh hiring, enterprises went to some of the best colleges in whichever market they operated in, hired people directly, and they hired people for a certain level of academic performance because that academic performance stood for, it was a proxy for ability. And then once you brought the person in, you then train them on your business context. You train them on certain specific modules that were built by people with years of experience, and the focus became, like you said, that content, that you've got to go through this to understand our environment. Now the thing about content is, in the past it could not be refreshed easily, because you built it once. It went on for 3 5 years. In some cases we've seen companies use the same content for 10 years, a certain way of instruction. And the process, if I use the phrase, overtook the purpose, because the purpose is that they learn and they're productive at their jobs. But the process of how the content was delivered became the focus. Now, today with technology, that's changing. First of all, you have access. You can, almost impart learning to people through a combination of live virtual environments at a scale that you couldn't before. People don't need to travel always to the same location. They can learn at their time and pace. That's one. The second part is curriculums have to change. So, for example, if you take a technology company or an automotive company, their cars are changing every quarter, every 6 months. Now, if you had to go back and change all that content every time you change something in the car so that people knew, that process would never catch up with the change. So now you've got to build capability that people have to understand the fundamentals of the shift. So that's what I mean by content delivery to capability building. And the third very important aspect is the workforce you're dealing with. Now, we work in a slightly dichotomous world, if I use that phrase, where on one side, there are places in the world where the numbers looking to find skilled jobs are very high. But the pool of people that employers want to look at, conversely, are very small because they want people with a certain set of skills from a certain background and so on and so forth. Now, if you want to keep those people engaged with your company, you want them to feel valued, you want them to contribute, you need to invest in their learning because they have more options than they ever had. Gone are the days when someone joined an enterprise and said, I'm going to spend the next 25 years here. Most people look at their careers in 3 year or 2 year sort of silos today because that's how they build experience. So in that context, content delivery has to shift to capability building because the employee is on a daily basis asking themselves, am I adding value to the company that I work for? But am I also adding value to my skills so that I am a better professional going forward? And if the answer to both of those is maybe or a no, people are at risk of attrition. So that's what I'd say is a big difference. And therefore, learning systems need to evolve from content to capability. They need to help people keep upskilling themselves because that's greater value for everybody in the ecosystem.
I'm going to sort of take this to the reports that you've done. So actually, I was on your website, upgradenterprise.com, when I sort of look at that, and I was really struck by your last four reports is what I've read. And, so when I look at that, I mean, one of the first things that struck me is you look at this whole thing of what employees want. What are professionals really looking at? Some of the answers are of no surprise. For example, everybody wants to learn about AI and the emerging technology, whether it's cybersecurity, etc. So I kind of found that to be interesting. The other was that you're looking at the soft skills. Interesting element that most people think that they don't really need to improve on that, and yet if you don't invest in soft skills, the organizations would not be able to move technical roles into leadership roles. So if anybody is considering that, they need to really start doubling up on the interpersonal side, the soft skills, etc. Why is this happening, and how do you address this awareness problem?
Yep, yep. I think you bring up a great point in the reports. Just for the listeners, like Abhijit said, we've done four reports in the last 6 months, but two which might be extreme relevant, which both came out in the last 2, 3 months. One is a workplace wish list report, and the other is a skilling smarter report. They sound synonymous, but skilling smarter is about how you skill better, and workplace wish list is about what employees really want, and especially Gen Z. And we've surveyed about 12 to 15,000 professionals across age groups in India. So for those who are interested, please go to the UpGrad Enterprise website and you can find it. But like you rightly said, Abhijit, the workplace wish list report, 83% of people surveyed out of a base of 12,000, so it's a pretty significant sample, said that they want to be skilled on AI. And they said that they want their employees to help them build that skill. And about 65% felt that they weren't being supported enough to acquire that skill, and they felt like they were novices. Now, if you take that, now obviously, AI is topical. Everyone's talking about it. It doesn't matter whether you're a techie or a non-techie. AI is impacting every job in some shape or form. So there is this question where the bulk of people are saying, hey, will this take over my job? But increasingly, the question is becoming, how do I become better at my job as AI augments a human? So if you take that particular case, let's take, for example, a sales professional in let's say, a field force, right? Now, that person today, whether you like it or not, is already using AI. They're using AI to type out emails. They're using AI to understand, things about their products. But that's where the soft skill comes in. So, for example, if a sales professional is going for a sales call, right? Earlier they just researched the company and or they talked about their product. But today you understand the individual as well. If you're talking to a particular buyer, you need to know what they're like. Some people like features-based proposition. Some people like softer skills, and that's where the soft skills you talk about come in when it comes to the client. How do you relate? How do you demonstrate empathy? How do you connect with the customer? What are ways in which you build a credible long-term relationship? Now, transposing the soft skills into team building, increasingly individual contributors become team leaders today at a scale not known before. Because as the workforce grows, you have to lead teams. And earlier, leadership was often by hierarchy. You were nominated to a particular role and your team was supposed to follow you because that's a hierarchy. But today, effective leadership is by influence. You may be named the leader, but to get people to walk along with you on the journey, you need to be able to lead by influence as well, not just your position. And that's where soft skills are important. How do you relate to different people in your team? How do you probably not teach by command but lead by example? How do you come across as someone who's complementing the skills your team has? How do you communicate? Is it often enough? How do you allay concerns? And to add to all of this, also important to realize that we've moved from a purely physical work environment to a hybrid environment. Earlier, people learned by watching managers at work and they said, okay, these are learned behaviors. But if, let's say, you have a workforce where it's 2 days work from home, 3 days work in office, people have flexibility, you don't get to watch other leaders at work. So you've got to learn that in the environment that you operate in, which is hybrid. So all of these are complexities where soft skills are very critical. And to that, you add the dimension of global teams. Some companies have teams that are truly global, cross-border, different cultures, languages in some cases come into play, while English might be the spoken language. So you see the layers of complexity that leaders have to navigate through at all levels, and that's where the soft skills are critical, and that's what we sort of invest in. So yes.
So, and when I was looking at your reports, I mean, there's one which you've done specifically for Gen Z.
Yes.
Which is interesting. You talked about how the workplace is, changing, and in so many workplaces, you actually now have 4 to 5 generations working side by side. Each one has a different learning style. They have different preferences. Their contexts are different. The experiences are different. So, in some sense, one size fits all is guaranteed to fail.
Yes.
What does Gen Z want, which is so different from, let's say, the oldest employee in the organization? How are they looking at it differently?
Yes. And I think that's a very good question. I do want to differentiate, though, that even saying that Gen Z or let's say, a slightly different age population is the same is also a misnomer. Because even within the same age group, different people learn differently.
Exactly.
Some of us learn better by reading a book, others learn through a conversation, others learn by doing things, and then you add the generational layer. So the key there, Abhijit, and this is what technology allows us to do, is to really blend learning. So you have a combination of what you'd call self-serve, augmented by live virtual classes. And what that does is that the self-serve part can be very often curated to what I as an individual want. So, for example, if I'm somebody who learns less through just watching videos, and I need more labs for practice, whereas my friend learns better through hearing an instructor speak. With AI and technology, I can tweak the same curriculum slightly to tailor both of them in the same course. And then what you can do is that the live virtual instruction, where an instructor is talking to a small group of people together, is to address dialogue, to address concerns that people have. And that makes for group learning. And research shows that small group peer to peer learning is still the most effective way that people learn, because human beings are tribal creatures. We learn from each other, we pick up cues from each other, and that is not going to go away. That is millions of years of evolution or hundreds of thousands of years of evolution at play. We are tribal creatures, we are social creatures. Now, the other part there also is how do you then have people work in groups? So we build our programs such that you're working on projects. And in those projects, often other softer skills come to play, right? The moment you have four people working on a project, instinctively certain roles are assumed in the project group. Somebody takes the lead on how the program is structured. Somebody plays to their technical strengths. Somebody becomes the motivator, making sure that others are on board, because motivation is very. Again, soft skills come to play. So as you can see earlier, that wasn't the case. All of us went through the same program. At the end of it, there was often, call it an assessment or an exam, maybe multiple choice, and you were evaluated on what you knew, the subject. But today you're evaluated on, have you demonstrated that skill in what's a simulated work environment. And I think that's a far better way to learn. What it also does, it gives employees a feel of your culture, how you are as a company. Because remember, that's what Gen Z want. In the past, if you were a Gen X or even earlier, or even to a certain extent Gen Y, they were happy to be in a very good work environment, and they were like, okay, I've got to get stuck in. Gen Z is a lot more, how do I put it? Like I said, open to choice. If they don't like something, they switch. And that's just the way they're wired, because, this is the age of Netflix. You don't like a Netflix video, you pause, you move to the next one in 15 seconds. You don't watch the movie for 1 hour to figure out whether it's good or not. That same principle applies in their careers as well. So how do you keep these people engaged? I think that is critical. So it's a very important conundrum for workplaces to work at. And I think the other part, and it's important for leaders to understand, is most often leaders tend to be from a previous generation. How do they understand what a Gen Z workforce wants, relate to it, is important. And personally for me, I use my teenage daughter as a proxy. She's my biggest teacher, because I get a sense of, at least one sense of what's happening on the street, if you call it. And, often if I can answer her questions, I believe that to a certain extent, I get to what Gen Z wants. And I'd recommend that to a lot of people. It's a tough school to please your teenager. It's almost impossible, but that's a great place to start. Yeah.
Yeah, so leverage your teenage nephews, nieces,
Yes,
and
exactly.
cousins, and anyone that you
Yes.
can do. Yeah, totally. I think that's a great place, and then this is also a good time when I'm going to take a commercial break and just sort of really talk about. I am doing a newsletter on LinkedIn. This has been there for I'm almost near 200 weekly newsletters I've done, and I would really urge you to take a look. And Shrikant, I don't know if you've had a chance to take
I
a look.
have. I have. Very impressive. I recommend it wholeheartedly to your listeners as well.
Thank you so much. I was hoping you are going to say something nice about the newsletter. Thank you for saying that. Now back to the whole question of how do we skill for a multi-generational workforce? And one of the thesis that I want to put across for you to respond to is, when you think about skilling, in the absence of linking it to careers, I think organizations are always going to flounder, because you have a skill which you cannot use. I mean, there's no point in my learning swimming if there is no swimming pool around? So in some sense, organizations need to really start doing that. So Gen Z or millennials or anybody else, I think everybody really believes that if there is something that is being learned, until you try it out, you actually don't learn anything, and there's no point learning unless I get a chance to try it out. So it's really a lot of that entire thing. One way to sort of parse this whole problem is to think about micro credentials. So when you look at how education needs to change, it has always been, as you said right at the beginning, that education was that you spend a certain amount of time, it culminates in a graduation ceremony, you get a degree. Today, when there are micro credentials, do you think the educational business model itself will change? Universities could potentially just start offering micro credentials, not just during those 1 year, 2 years, or 4 years that the student is there, but just to continue doing that.
Yeah, they do. In fact, look, degrees are not going to go away because the university system is still the primary way in which people go through school and university. But increasingly, what you'd call micro credentialing or stackable skills become more and more important because, what is going to happen is, you might come out of university with a particular degree or a qualification, but suddenly you're in a role where you need very, very different skills. And therefore, how do you learn that particular skill? How do you get certified for it from an accredited body? And that body could be someone like an UpGrad. It could be someone like an UpGrad in partnership with the university. It could even be a professional body outside. It could even be your employer who sets certain standards. But being able to say that I have learned this particular skill and I've combined 2, 3 skills together is extremely important. I'll take real examples. So today, if let's say you're building a product based for let's say, when I say product, I mean a client offering for a financial services company. Let's say you work for one of the world's largest banks. Now, obviously, you need to understand financial services. So you might have done some qualification related to that. You need to understand technology because most financial products tend to be online today, etc., which means you need to understand the impact of cloud, the impact of, let's say, AI, etc. You need to understand how to relate to a consumer, because you're dealing with consumers across different age groups, etc. You need to understand the regulatory environment. You're bringing all of this together. Now, one university degree done a few years earlier can't teach you all of this. So, you could, in this particular case, work with someone like us to say, okay, I've learned how building cloud first is. I've learned how financial services skills are. I've learned how consumer behavior works. And, these are all stackable skills where you spend 2 months doing this, 3 months doing that over the course of a 2-3 year period. And so you become this unique professional who can address products for financial services in the consumer environment. Now, this is also a career path for you because if you're doing that, let's say, I just take hypothetical names, a MasterCard or a Visa. The next time a big bank invests in that technology, they look at someone like you as opposed to somebody who spent time in another bank. That's how I've seen people build their careers, and that's critical. And therefore, what we find is you will find very few people with very, very similar backgrounds going forward because think of it as a shopping basket, if I call it that. Over the course of your career, you keep adding different things to your shopping basket. And by the time you get midway through your career, your shopping basket looks very different from someone else's, although you might have started at the very same place. And I think that's a very important way to look at stackable skills. And I think the more people look at that, the more they'll spend time skilling themselves more regularly as opposed to saying that, look, every 5-7 years I'll go back, learn something and come back. This is a constant journey. You've got to keep thinking about, am I current? Am I up to speed? What else is happening out there in the market? Because you are responsible for your career. Your employer will try and do the best they can for the work environment you work in. But at the end of the day, we all own our own narratives. We own our careers. We own our professional journeys.
I definitely think that, picking up the thread from what you just said, that as individuals start to take responsibility for their own skilling and their own career path, it will become important for people to start really investing a certain amount of money for themselves, doing their own upskilling. So one of the ways that I was having this conversation with one of the younger people that I was coaching, and I was saying, think about it like, instead of thinking about stepping out for a meal, just put that one meal as what you are investing in yourself. That equivalent amount, put it aside and learn something, whatever it might be. And if you think you don't want to really start by learning, let's say, about AI and all of that, learn how to play the guitar, anything. It's just a question of getting used to that idea that this is fun. I think far too long, the whole process of fun has been dealing from this and it's become a serious task. And that's really what gets people yawning. So I think make it fun, learn something, and then bring back something else. So that's a one. So that's how I would think about lifelong learning, which also means that higher education, in a way, is moving from what used to be really driven by the teacher. So it used to be a very teacher centric place, and instead it's now become more learner centric. How is UpGrad doing that differently?
Yeah, I think that's again, something that's very critical to our sort of our evolution. Earlier, again, it was teacher centric because one believed that a particular teacher or instructor carried certain credibility. So if I heard them speak, I had learned what's best in the industry. But if you look at teachers or instructors today across the globe, you could be a tenured professor at a global top tier university, you could be a thought leader in a particular space. You'll find that they're evolving, they're learning from their environment as well. So the strength is to blend all of that to what is unique to the learner, and that's what we do really well. We'd like to think we do that really well. How do you bring the best of breed across the board? And in fact, I'll take an example of something we're launching in a couple of months. We are working with one of the world's top three universities. I'd like to keep the surprise for our listeners, where we bring something that's quite, it's very new to the market. We bring that first to India at scale on AI, given the theme on AI, where you've got probably about 15 of the university's most celebrated professors and tenured professors, and they're worldwide. They're famous. Most of them are famous worldwide. Building this specifically keeping the learner in mind. Now, in the past, you to access that particular instructor or learner, you would probably have to go do a course at that university, which is extremely tough to get into, and it costs a lot of money. But now that's at your doorstep. Now, if you look at that, we're not just stopping at that. What we're doing is, depending on different personas, we're blending that learning path for different roles, like I said. So, for example, if you're let's say a manufacturing professional, what does AI mean to you? So there's a combination of 4 or 5 sub modules which come together to create a learning path with a lab thrown in, with some mentorship session that makes it unique for you. That is the shift from the teacher centric to the learner centric, because earlier you just listened to a particular kind of content delivered in a particular way, and then you had to put the effort to contextualize it to your environment, the learner's environment. But today, companies like us do it for you, so that then you can think about, how do I use this in my workplace and how do I get better? That last question is very important, because one thing in learning is that you can customize, you can make it easy in terms of access, availability, disaggregate learning, so you could learn in 10-minute bites as opposed to 2-hour sessions, etc. But the learner has to have the motivation to want to learn, and that there's no substitute for that. If you want to get better, you have to try yourself. Once you demonstrate that willingness, the ecosystem comes into play to make it very specific to you as an individual. I'll take example. So you talked about multiple generations. So if you've got different generations in the same, let's say, cohort of learning, let's say some people don't have familial obligations, they can learn through the day, but others are dealing with young kids, they're dealing with whatever, so they got to learn late at night when the kids are asleep, or some people have long commutes, they learn when they commute. In the past, these were disadvantages because you either were in the class or you were not. But today, with a combination of virtual learning, like you said, some labs or even live instructions, you can fit it to what is learner specific. Someone could be doing a part of the course when they commute. Others could fit it around their work style, and all of these could be equally effective for that individual. So that's the shift, huge shift. But I think it's going to repurpose or reset the entire skilling space in the next decade to come. Yeah.
I if I were to piece together the 4 or 5 things that you talked about, one was, you talked about moving from content delivery to capability building as your first sort
Yes,
of piece. The second thing you talked about was the shift away from degrees to, let's
stackable
say, micro
skills. Yes.
credentials. Yeah, stacking what you've learned. So that's your third. And third is to do it in terms of time, to do it on an ongoing, regular basis. So when you are talking of lifelong learning, it's really how do you build that element into it, and then the entire process shifting from somebody else doing it for you to it moves to you, to the learner. So from teacher centric to learner centric, which in some sense depends heavily on your intrinsic motivation. And if I were to put this together, one is really talking about, let's say, moving from a local to a global ecosystem. So that ecosystem, how does one go about building it? What's the role that an upgrad can provide to the individual and to the organization? If you were to just segregate these two, if I'm an individual, how can I use upgrad to be able to do all of the above? And two, if I'm an employer, how do I use that to do all of the above?
No, completely. So, look, I think you summarized that really well. Content to capability, degrees to stackable skills, teacher centric to learner centric, one time to lifelong. But this local to global aspect is super, super critical as well. So, again, earlier access was the biggest issue because, when you were to access a global ecosystem, in offline learning, either you took the learner to where the learning happened, which meant it was expensive and difficult to get to, or you brought the learning to where the learner was, which was again very difficult. Today, with the development of what I call online learning, that's become a level set. But now, when you talk about live virtual online, that takes it to the next level. So, talking about the local to global ecosystem, for example, today you and I are sitting probably a few thousand miles apart, but we're having this conversation like we're sitting next to each other, if you look at it that way. The ability to bring in best in class instructors or people that you can learn from and weave that into a seamless learning path is a huge, huge skill, underestimated value add. And that's what companies like UpGrad bring to the table. So if you take AI again as an example, and I'm taking AI because 9 out of 10 conversations with our learners today, irrespective of which part of the world it is in, is about AI.
Absolutely.
You know, learners want to learn about what's happening in Silicon Valley, what's happening in, let's say, Mumbai or Bangalore, what's happening in China. And you've got to be able to bring people in with experience from all of that stuff. They also want to know what is, let's say, a pharma company doing about privacy in AI. Healthcare records are very critical. What is a bank doing about financial information? Now, to bring all of this together, you have to be able to tap a global ecosystem and weave that into a context or a narrative or a learning pathway that is useful to the individual so that it opens up their worldview. And you can do that through technology very, very easily. But you've got to be able to do that with the right scale and the brand, which is where the value add of companies like UpGrad brings. Because not many companies can access all these global ecosystems. Now, the other part is how do you ensure what is relevant to your learners? For that, you need a large learner base. If you're a university who skills or let's say provide degrees to 15 or 20 or 30,000 people a year. That's a huge number. However, that's a number that's localized. If you're an upgrad who skills 2 million people a year, you have a very different perspective on learners across the world want. If you're a company like UpGrad, which deals with 400 global corporations, many of whom are Fortune 500, that's again a proxy for what is the employee asking for today, because some of our clients are dealing with attrition problems, others are dealing with career progression problems, others are dealing with growth problems, and therefore how do they make careers meaningful for their people? Now, all these inputs come into how we build our ecosystems and tap the global network, and that I think is a huge skill. I mean, so for example, people like you, Abhijit, we are looking at how you can be a very, very senior sort of a mentor in many of our programs. That conversation 5-10 years ago would have been much more difficult given locational constraints. But today you're part of our global ecosystem. So, yeah.
And I think when you look at these things, fundamentally what it means is there are some changes that the employer needs to do, to sort of really start to think about as they are doing the changes in the business model, they need to, in parallel, start having this conversation about what skills are going to be needed. So the skills portfolio is a dynamic conversation. And one of the things that, as I'm working with different organizations, I find that that process is where the problem starts, that the business model changes, or what's happening, let's say, in sales as they're trying to sell, that gap between what they are experiencing in the field versus the skills that they are looking at, it needs to be in real time.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen. So I think that's an opportunity
Yeah.
for every organization to
And I'll
improve.
touch on one thing that is very, very valid is, companies, especially leadership teams of companies, always want to look at ROI. They want to look at
Yeah.
what's the benefit of an initiative. And there is this misconceived sort of notion out there that, hey, learning is a spend, and as long as we meet certain milestones, X people went through Y program, I've met my objective. Actually, I'd like to correct the perception, and the world leading organizations see this already, is learning is as much an input for into your employee retention, into your employee
Oh,
sort of
completely.
thing, as much as an increment twice a year. Because if you don't invest in upskilling your employees, your attrition goes up. That's a direct, we see that in most cases, because employees expect their employees to invest in them. In fact, our survey showed that about 70% of employees believe that their employers don't make enough investments in skilling them across the globe. Now, if you're saying that, hey, look, I want to solve attrition, you're not just solving it for the cost, because the cost of a new hire is more. But increasingly in today's world, as basic knowledge is ubiquitous given technology, context is critical. The context of your unique work environment, your business, all the nuances that come with it. And every time an employee leaves, you're losing some of that context. And
Yeah.
more employees leave, you lose that organizational context, which is often your secret sauce to success. If I take an example in the automotive space, one could say a car is a car is a car. How does it matter? But the reality is that as consumers, you and I both drive. We have nuances for a particular car. It could be the features, it could be the experience with the dealer, it could be whatever else. But there are people in that company who made that experience unique for me, because of which I buy that car. And if enough of those people leave, that context is lost. And I think that is very critical for companies to realize that upskilling is as much a hard financial benefit as many, many other more tangible ones that show up on your P&L of
I
balance sheet.
think when companies think of the compensation and benefits that they offer to an employee, this should be one part of the negotiation, that we invest this much in your skilling, which could be done either through what you do, we provide you the time to do it, and therefore that's an investment, or we provide you the money to do it, or maybe both, because you would need both to actually do that on an ongoing basis. But I would also say that the individual needs to do exactly the same conversation with themselves. This is the time I'm going to spend, this is the money I'm going to spend. And I do see that happening more and more, because, a lot of times individuals sign up to do things which their company does not invest in necessarily. So there's this fairly young entrepreneur who is running a reasonably successful firm, and he was saying that, I wish somebody had invested in, a coach for me. And many organizations do it, just very selectively. My question is, why wouldn't you do it by paying for it yourself? So those are some of the ways in which the world is going to change. Just as we come to the end of this conversation, I would ask you for your learning habits and preferences. How has that changed, Shrikant, when you were in school and college, and later as you started working? What were significant shifts in your learning style, if at all there was?
No, I think it's not been conscious, Abhijit, but there has been a change. If I look back, and this is a discussion we have at home as well, I think if you went back in the one thing I'm fortunate about is I do read quite a bit, and this is something I learned from my parents. They both read, and therefore I've read, and that helps. And I would recommend to all our listeners, there is no substitute to just reading and being curious. That's number one. But the way one read has changed. Earlier, I probably read books. I'd buy a book and read it. I still do buy physical books. That's just tells you how old I am. There's no substitute sitting with a cup of coffee and reading a book when you can. But time is difficult to find all the time. And therefore, I end up learning in what I call smaller bits. Going back to your point about stackable, that's how I learn a lot more. I listen to some podcasts, podcasts like the one we're doing today. I read in small bits, and I probably read less books end to end. I tend to read like certain snippets of those or certain key components, move on. But the other thing I've really learned from, which is different from before, is I learn a lot more through conversations today. I learn by talking to people who are outside of your normal working environment, and because often we talk about connecting the dots, and I know you and I spoke about this, right? All of us say you connect the dots, you get a clearer picture. If you pick a dot which is way outside your landscape, it just opens up a whole new vista to the picture. And that's how I found I learn. Like I said, one thing I've tried to do very consciously, because I used to think I was tech savvy, but clearly an AI native workforce is far more tech savvy than I am. And there are certain things that I've learned. For me, even today, while I use the mobile a lot, I use it like a desktop, or I mean a laptop, right? For a mobile first Gen Z audience, a laptop is a very archaic concept. So how do they interact with technology? I talk to a lot of young people wherever I can. My daughter's friends, others are learners themselves. So it's a combination of all these aspects. So all I'd say is, spending too much time curating what you learn is often, in my view, the biggest disservice you can do to yourself. Yes, there are certain areas you want to focus on learning for because they're related to your work or your skill, but being curious sometimes opens up some amazing things. Personally, I'm a big history buff. For example, I read a lot of history. In a different world, I might have been a history professor, for all you know. But reading history sometimes gives me different parallels or context that I can relate to today's environment. Other people use others. I'd say just be curious. Just be curious and be insatiable. That's probably the best way to learn. So, yeah.
Who are some of your favorite writers? What are
Yeah.
some of the
So
books you would
look,
recommend?
in recent times, I've read a lot on technology. I really enjoyed Mustafa Suleiman's book on AI. That was actually very very good. But if you take I read a lot of Yuval Noah Harari as well. I mean, I'm a big fan of his books. I've read a lot of Michael Lewis's books as well. He's got a very interesting take on sort of the I think the interaction between society and economy and certain specific businesses, if you call it that. But I also, end up reading, like I said, history. So coming back to India, interestingly, I've read every one of William Dalrymple's books, and
Oh, one of my favorites too.
and his podcast is something I've listened to as well. So that's actually quite interesting. So quite a wide variety in that sense. So yeah, yeah, yeah.
Fantastic. Shrikant, thank you so very much. I just want to summarize some of the ideas that we talked about. I think it's very clear that, from what Shrikant talked about today, that the way that we invest in ourselves and in the organizations, both need to really start rethinking how they invest in upskilling. And when you are looking at that whole process of upskilling, there is some stuff that you should do by yourself. There's some investment you need to make by yourself, and some that the employers, and especially the good ones. In fact, one of the things that when I was working with LinkedIn on their workplace learning report for 2025, the best employers are the ones which invested in career building and creating career paths as they are creating the skills. So that is really perhaps for me the thing that I am going back with. And thank you for all your recommendations. I totally agree that William Dalrymple is a fabulous writer. I love his podcast too, and so totally recommend and endorse that. Thank you once again for being here, and I so appreciate the time and the suggestions you made.
I mean,
Thank you
thank you
very
so
much.
much. Really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on the show.